What's up guys, Houndish here, and today we're going to jump in and analyse some of the big Eververse feedback in the game right now. So we'll talk about Eververse, but also season passes, other microtransactions, and how they affect and play into the rest of D2. There's a hell of a lot of opinion when it comes to the store, so I could sit here and purely reel off what I think, but I reckon the more effective way to get a sense of how the community feels is to analyse some of the feedback from other Destiny players. Of course, the bias tends to lean towards what's wrong with Eververse as opposed to what's great about it, but looking at Season 8, Shadowkeep, and most seasons over the past year or so, Eververse continues to be Destiny 2's most updated vendor, and on top of that, Year 3 comes with its own list of fairly significant changes, so it's definitely a good time to talk about it, and that includes you guys as always, so definitely sound off with your thoughts in the comment section below. And so we are going to talk about the economy, how expensive the store can actually be, and the rarity of currency like Bright Dust, but first, let's touch on the Eververse balance shift, the cosmetic appeal of store items, and why TES has the biggest reward inventory in all of D2. So right here, some threads and thoughts from other players can be pretty insightful or spark interesting conversation. And there's one here. Eververse has a really nice ornament set, and the season pass has another, but meanwhile the dungeon has the same armor as the moon. My boss drop was a helmet that I already had, and as someone who keeps up with the paid content, it's such a buzzkill to see all of this cool stuff in the game not directly attached to cool content like the dungeon. And of course this is an opinion which some may not absolutely agree with, however, it does raise the question of Eververse value. There was a Reddit thread in Opulence which spoke about how Eververse had significantly more loot in the store than all of the new activities, quests, and actual gameplay rewards for that season. And it's no lie, if you scroll through everything that TES has for this season, versus Eris, the Lectern, and say Zavala and Shaxx, even if you combine those other vendors, they collectively probably have less new stuff than what Eververse has, of course if you exclude things like the bounties. And this is something that folks talk about, but the thing to bear in mind is that Eververse doesn't have weapons or provide any additional gameplay, right? It can obviously be argued that the gameplay value is significantly less than a lot of the items we're going to pick up off other vendors, right? Moon weapons from the Lectern, for example. And so we can't really compare a very popular new weapon to a single shader or exotic drop from Eververse in most cases. But Bungie devs have said that currently there aren't any plans for significant vendor updates in the game, and that for them it's a case of prioritizing new activity content with a less focus on having rolling vendor inventories and things like that. And so I'd be curious to get thoughts from you guys about this. I know that there's a really strong desire for more exciting vendors on a weekly basis, and I can understand there being frustration at the fact that while that desire isn't really being met at the levels that players would like, Eververse continues to get such expansive updates every season. So I think it's definitely a valid conversation, and I'm curious to hear what you guys think about it. There is a lot of focus on cosmetics in the conversation right now, and how in general, if you take armor, a lot of the best looking stuff is either sold via Eververse or another transaction like the Season Pass. And now this is an objective conversation because lots of people like different cosmetics. But you could say that there is a sort of consensus there, kind of like with a cool sports car or some dope sneakers. They might not be your personal preference, it might not be your style, or might not have the right color scheme or whatever it is. But generally we can see when a thing is special or somewhat unique, and that's probably what we can apply to Season Pass armor ornaments or the Season 8 Eververse armor ornaments as well. And on the subject of Season Pass armor and weapons, Bungie do plan to do something different by actually selling catch-up ranks for the Season Pass close to the end of the season. And so this totally validates the transaction argument around the armor and even the weapons in the past, because at a certain point in time, players will be able to buy progress towards obtaining those items. And of course you could get into a whole different conversation there, including the fact that this will be the closest thing to buying actual weapons in D2 that we've had. But back to the real point, lots of the more appealing but also unique and themed items, as well as armor in the game, do come from Eververse or the Season Pass. And so, why is that the case? Well, of course, it's because Bungie want us to show them the money. And that may sound kind of salty or toxic, but it's just business, right? Cool stuff makes money, and trash stuff makes, well, probably a lot less money. So considering we know that there is appealing content in Eververse, folks are now talking about the actual economy surrounding it. So we'll talk about that, but also note some recognition of this feedback from Bungie. In one of the popular Eververse threads at the moment, the OP pointed out that it costs as much or more than a season pass to buy a lot of items in the Eververse store. And I personally do agree that, $10 for most Eververse items is pretty silly, but of course you can say that for any place in retail, right? there will always be items or things which, depending on what's valuable to the individual, could trigger somebody to say, why on earth would you spend X amount on that? Right? I think a lot of stuff is expensive in the store, but it's most difficult to complain about something like that when the number one argument will be, well, simply don't buy it. And that's an argument that in itself I kind of agree with as well. I think the real point that we come to is a fairer marketplace. The part where I would personally call Bungie to action would be to have a page in the store which has a list of items in 2 different collections, right? Those which will only be sold for silver in a season, and those which can be sold for bright dust, as well as silver. I think it's only fair that the community should actually know, okay, this season, I can definitely get all of this armor for bright dust if I watch the store and wait for them to come up. Or of course, I can definitely get this certain exotic ship at some point, or, in some cases, if I want this item, I know that I have to buy it and there isn't an alternative. This way, players actually get to make a decision with all of the facts about the value of the item that they want to buy. If they choose to purchase an item for silver, when they can see that it is going to be sold for bright dust at some point, then at the very least, players shouldn't really feel tricked afterwards, if that item sells for bright dust a week later. And so I think that's quite a big thing at the moment. But of course, speaking of bright dust, lots of people are talking about the economy, and it is one of the biggest points of feedback this season because we no longer earn the currency when deleting Eververse items. Obviously, there is a limiting factor to how much bright dust we can actually earn because of that, and this kind of runs in parallel with the removal of Eververse engram drops via XP. And of course, we now primarily pick these up at particular season ranks, which further limits how many Eververse items we can actually earn via gameplay, but once again, the ability to turn those items into currency to buy new stuff. So a lot of players are talking about how diminishing bright dust reserves actually are at the moment, and Sir Prankalot made a point about weekly bounties from Zavala, the Drifter, and Shax, so these have become the main source for bright dust. And you can earn 1200 bright dust if you do every one of those bounties per week on one of your characters. And that means you can get up to 3600 bright dust if you were to do all of the bounties on 3 characters. Now, those aren't actually terrible amounts of bright dust to earn whatsoever. I think the real complaint probably comes with specifically how long it would take to actually do all of those. That may depend at what point in the kind of end game you are as well, right? If you're at the point where pinnacle power is your main grind, then you aren't really looking for the standard power drops you might see in Gambit or Crucible. And so equally, if those are pieces of content you wouldn't typically play, it does end up feeling like a fair amount of effort to go into those activities purely for bright dust. And so I think some improvements on that front would definitely be nice. I think as well that because there is such a focus on upgrades, pinnacle power grind, and the current kind of economy around endgame and gameplay upgrades specifically, I think players definitely feel kind of fatigued by the weekly bounties. And so I'd be curious to how you feel about that, because once again, 3,500 or so bright dust definitely isn't a bad amount to earn. I think it's about improving that system and making it feel like a little bit less effort where effort shouldn't necessarily be required at that level. And there are quite a few suggestions for improvements that Bungie are actually responding to. So Eldir for Life suggested that owning the Season Pass should give you a 50% discount on all seasonal Eververse content to make the economy more fair. Another good suggestion from Faded Titan is that Bungie could actually add silver as drops throughout the Season Pass, so we would at least have a way of pooling up, maybe 1,000 silver or something like that. And I think these are totally valid ideas. Community managers have also responded to both of those key threads and said that they are pushing that feedback to the teams. And so that's absolutely a good thing. We should recognize that Bungie are not kind of ignoring this feedback, or at least they are recognizing it, and hopefully that means that we're going to get a bigger communication from Bungie, perhaps if they have any plans for Season of Dawn, or of course Eververse changes beyond that. There are even suggestions for the whole Eververse system to get flipped back to pretty much how it was, so some players still think we should get seasonal engrams, Eververse items should dismantle for bright dust, and that we should get bright dust bounties from Eververse at the same time. And so I'm curious to hear what you guys think about kind of resolutions to some of these problems, but to summarize in general where the community stands, and these of course aren't all of the complaints, but are probably the biggest complaints in general. So firstly, players still feel that more dope cosmetics should come from endgame content, and it especially irritates some players that Eververse or Season Pass armor ornaments look very unique, and that there are activities in the game at the same time that could totally benefit from even some of that loot dropping there instead. Secondly, there is feedback that the cost of transaction items is pretty high, and in terms of value, many players feel that a single cosmetic item shouldn't cost as much as an entire Season Pass does. Thirdly, I think a lot of players still want to see the Eververse Store do a better job of defining items within a season and whether they are exclusively dropping for silver or whether they can be bought for bright dust. And I think in general, players don't enjoy the sometimes vague nature of the Eververse Store. The fourth major kind of point of feedback centers around the economy, where players feel that we should still earn more Eververse engrams, and of course that would increase chances of getting seasonal Eververse items, but also that our opportunities to earn Bright Dust are too limited or require specific grinds, which aren't especially fun or rewarding. And the fifth potential complaint possibly looks a little bit like Eververse should be deleted and tests thrown off the tower, and I think while some of us can totally relate to that emotion, it's clear that Bungie aren't going to ditch Eververse, and, as they have mentioned, there are specific pieces of content which are actually produced using funds from Eververse. So it isn't simply Bungie's big cash pot, and whether we like it or not, it's absolutely part of the economy of supporting the game, as well of course as being a potentially big profit margin for Bungie. I think the bottom line is that it is part of the ecosystem, no matter what we think about it, and so the most progressive thing we can do is push feedback about making that store fairer and more transparent, and also that I think as a community, we do see a lot of resources going into the Eververse store, so I could totally relate to all of the feedback, guys, but really, that sums up everything I wanted to talk about in this video. Be sure to give your key points of feedback down in the comment section, because hopefully at the very least, some of these minor changes could be looked at for upcoming seasons in the near future. If you guys have enjoyed the conversation, a rating below very much helps me out though, and if you want to see more videos like this, as well as news coverage, guides, and a bunch of other content associated with the world of Destiny, then be sure to get subscribed here on the channel. You can also turn on notifications so I can keep you up to date, but otherwise I appreciate you tuning in as always, and whatever you guys get up to, I hope you have an awesome day.